Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we're bringing you day 740 of Russian invasion into Ukraine. As always, with former advisor to the Office of the President of Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel Alexey Arestovych, and Ukrainian journalist Nikolay Feldman. Today, they deep dive into the system of military organization in Ukraine and its peculiarities. The show, original one, was over 2 hours long, so it'll be split in two parts. And we always are appreciative of our members. Today, thanks go to PSH and Vadim Cherdak. Thank you guys for supporting our channel. And with this, let's deep dive into day 740. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. This is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolay Feldman. This is Military War Diary with Alexey. Thank you for tuning in from wherever you are. Good evening, everybody. Let's start with fortifications. There is a ton of publications about Ukraine fortifications, and I saw on Facebook the statement by our servicemen, by the soldiers and officers who were leaving Avdiivka about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. They were saying that this statement that was officially made, that withdrawal from Avdiivka is happening to prepared positions, this was an absolute lie. And people who were leaving Avdiivka, they ended up having to dig their own trenches and their own fortifications with their own hands and their own shovels. This week, New York Times and Bild and other Western publications tell us stories about the troops being withdrawn and outline the general area where they're fortifying now. Let's discuss what do we know about this new fortification set. Well, let's not go into what do I know. Let's use the officially available information, so we're not implying some insider knowledge in this case, even if we do have some. So let's take a look at the satellite imaging, and they do not really show hard positions there. Our troops also comment that we do not have any fortifications, or there are some very minimal. So what are we to conclude? That there are no fortifications, or that there are not enough fortification areas, or they're not fully equipped, not fully prepared. And I will remind our viewers that Avdiivka is the first offensive campaign since the beginning of 22 by Russian troops, when after taking a big milestone, they have not stopped, having exhausted themselves, but they actually continued their effort. Yeah, they miscalculated and they thought life is peachy and pushed forward, and 15th Brigade basically ceased to exist in the next 2 days after that mistake. But they're still trying to push. And this is not good. This means that situationally or systemically, they've achieved the level when they can try to convert operative tactical level of success after a stabilization of the front, can turn into an operative success. When Zaluzhny was writing in The Economist on the 1st of November that there is a stalemate that can be overcome only with technical measures and technical advancements, in reality, this stalemate can also be overcome with organizational measures. And this is one of the issues that was highlighted this week. It was highlighted a couple of weeks ago by Russians taking Avdiivka. And it is that their organizational form is better, is finer than what we have in Ukraine. And unfortunately, we do not have constant organs of management, bodies of management above the brigade level. And they do. And this is division, and this is the level of an army. One can ask, why cannot you fight with a collection of brigades with different tools available for the higher commander? I was asked online by somebody, do we have artillery brigades? When I mentioned that Russians are leaving artillery brigade near Bakhmut. Well, artillery brigade is worse than many other things, because like many other detachments as a part of a bigger group, it's different than a brigade by itself. And when it's a bigger group, such as detachment or army, there are certain traditions, certain specific ways to conduct operations, commanders who've been working with each other and who know how to work together. That gives and creates what French call esprit de corps, a spirit of the corps. And this is a qualitative change in this case. So here we have the first drafts of such growth on the Russian side. General Mordvichov, who took Mariupol, so he has some experience of taking difficult positions with very resilient resistance by defenders. So he got 3 armies, a tank division, and a bunch more brigades. That's on the old times scale, that's an army level operation. Today, Russian army is about 1/3 of the Soviet army, but is still called an army. So he got 3 of them, roughly equivalent of 1 Soviet army. And they conducted an operation that actually had some wind to continue the push after taking one of the most fortified positions on the east. And this is a notable achievement, to break the defense of the enemy, the most serious one that they were struggling with. And that achievement has 2 significant characteristic features. So first, it was organized. It was well organized among different groups. And of course, it is implied that they used technical elements like aerial bombs and massive use of that, but still, it wasn't the end of it. It was also coordination between the troops. And the second feature is that they continued pushing after taking it. They didn't go far. It was 4 kilometers, but still they continued. And if the next qualitative jump will occur to some other general, not Mordvichov, but somebody else, they will have more troops that know how to conduct these operations, that have done successfully that. And I will remind that in Soviet Union, the norms of losses for these operations were 12 to 20%. This time they lost about 30%. Of course, there is room for them to learn, but we are risking a situation when next time, instead of 4 kilometers, they might try to push for more, for a longer distance. Of course, Soviet army had a norm of going up to 150 kilometers. I don't think they'll be able to do that. I don't think they use Soviet art of war as the example, but their life basically pushes them to certain conclusions. And, you know, Soviet Union and Wehrmacht were 2 countries that succeeded in these dynamic large-scale operations. And even Wehrmacht operations were lagging behind the Manchuria operation by Soviet Union against the Kwantung army. So essentially, Russia is drifting slowly to what they were taught back in the Soviet Union. Their tragedy for them, a good thing for us, was that they initially ran way too far towards the NATO model at the beginning of this war. And when they conducted this war as the NATO operation style event, we know what it turned out to be. Catastrophic losses and pants being pulled down and butt being whipped. But they had enough political will to continue this war, and during this war they're slowly drifting towards the Soviet system. That system included amassing large numbers of means and ways, and then learning how to use that better. And this is sort of laws of nature of war. It does come to, at the end, at the big operations, big-scale wars, who will be more proficient in using big numbers. And they're slowly learning how to do that. Now look at us. We do not have constant organizational bodies above brigade. They do. They have armies, they have detachments. We don't. Zaluzhny was begging, was explaining, was showing to Zelensky and his command that he needed regular bodies, organizational bodies above the detachment level, so he could unite several and would be able to conduct more complex operations, because then you can actually give orders within the bigger group and not just work with each individual brigade. I'm trying to come with a good comparison. Imagine if your channel would be managed by a management group that is changing every 6 months instead of a regular established group. Or imagine a family where a new mother and father coming to kids every half a year and then saying, well, we're your new parents, and then 6 months later some other parents will become your parents. So that's what Zaluzhny was precluded from doing. This is a colossal mistake in my view. because it outlines on a long distance that these brigades, a potpourri of brigades thrown at the enemy, doesn't work that effective. In 2014, 2015, Muzhenko was trying to aggregate them, and he actually used them as bigger organizational groups. But the wish of us to be more independent, more nimble, more fluid prevailed. There were hotshots screaming that we need NATO standards, and okay, NATO standards are fine, but only when you have all the resources of NATO and you're a NATO member. But when you're not part of NATO, you don't have NATO resources, you definitely need different standards. And our thing would be not NATO school, not Soviet school, but our own Ukrainian traditional school that we were defining in lieu of fighting the wars. So unfortunately now our society is split in two halves. One of them is screaming to hell with Soviet Union and their rules, will be fighting differently. And on the other hand, we have people who are saying that we need to go to NATO standards. This is our only salvation, without understanding that we do not have NATO logic, NATO logistics, NATO resources, and we're not a NATO country. Because NATO battalion is not alone on the front. Behind him there is a whole pyramid of all means and measures that provide intel, provide logistics, provide support. It's a different system. And another problem that we face is that instead of cadre military, we grow a large number of those who have been to war. And the difference between professional military, professional warfighter, and the one who's been there is that not one has been there more than the other, but that professional has a proper education, has a system of values that he knows, and that is common to the army. And he also has the culture, or what is called the culture, the system of traditions. And it's difficult to grow a systemic officer, a cadre officer, if they're not managed by constant or established bodies of organization. And they do not have a large experience of growth and managing different bodies of army, different groups. You can grow a division, but in order for it to be a good division, it needs to be trained for a long time. It needs to be getting a lot of experience. And then if you try to bring it one level higher to the army level, that's even more effort. It can be done during the war, but we're not doing it. And my resume is very simple here. Systemically, on that level, Russia starts to outplay us in terms of management, of troops management, because they emphasized the solid structure. They have division, they have detachments and armies. We managed to create corps. We did not switch the whole army to that, the whole defense forces. We have three. And how these three corps were devised and implemented, that's a whole other story that probably will be written after the war. And this is another factor that will be notable as Russian troops will be getting more experience. And it will be notable more and more as a factor on the field. And in some time frame, perhaps a rather short time frame, and it should not be measured in actual months, it should probably be measured in successful operations. So 2 or 3 more successful operations like that, they will have enough experience to be more effective and grow to a new level. And we won't, and we'll continue to bravely fight against them, but we will be lacking this higher level organizational structure. And that is a drawback, and a sad one, because the structure provides better logistics, better organization, more effectivity, and they are doing it slowly, in a bad manner, not effective manner, how they often do it, but they're still going in the right direction. So, Alexey, you think it's a more complex thing because we're not even building fortifications, because you started talking about Avdiivka and the need to build fortifications for our troops in high alert mode, right? Not in panicking, but they were rather sharp statements. And I think it was, you started back in September, right? Exactly, it was September when Avdiivka was way far from being taken. And it's a systemic issue. And I tried to bring it up starting with September and going on, and I got my share of grief for bringing this up. And I'm ready to endure as much grief as need be if things are going to change in the country. But sad thing is that nothing is changing on the large scale in Ukraine. Look, we also have publication by Yuri Butusov, a war correspondent, about our fortifications, and he reminds how the whole situation unfolded. He said that on the 1st of December, Supreme Commander-in-Chief ordered to start construction of fortification areas, and now Butusov is writing that on most of objects that are planned for construction, the works have not started. Where they have, it's only at the first level. Not a single project is finished, and the tempo is very slow. And replacement of Zaluzhny for Syrsky cannot be a factor, cannot change anything. As he says, as I wrote, providing materials for construction and mobilizing construction experts is not a matter of military. Army does not have enough resources to conduct this construction operations, and Minister of Defense Sumerov is taking care of other hot fires and is relatively afraid to bring up this matter with the president's office because he doesn't want to go conflicting with them. So I have a question. How real... sorry, Nikolay, we need to add more things here. Recently, there was a scream in the social networks, a public wave. We're not referring to any insides. I don't think it's a good technology to refer to. So let's just look at what real publications are that are available. And the Officer of Engineering Troops has published his experience. It was taken down later. I think he was forced to remove it, but he was describing how he arrives to brigades and what problems does he face. And most problems are going around the fact that engineering officers in the brigade have very poor training. They're not trained to build quality fortifications. And the experience that we received during the Second World War, or what we had left after the Soviet army was gone, that was forgotten largely on the brigade level. In the higher level of army structure, there are engineers and specialists who still know how to do that. Not as effectively as Soviet and German armies back in 1945, but we still have some understanding. And his highlight was outlining the disconnect between the higher level of command, of engineering command, and the engineering specialist on the brigade level. Because when we come, as he says, with drafts and plans and all, they only can dig from here to dinner. They're not sophisticated, they don't have enough understanding of what needs to be done. And so this problem exists inside the army, right? What exists outside the army we'll talk about a little later. And it's not a secret that's very difficult to make the warfighter dig his own trench. The army apparently falls into two categories. One, people absolutely refuse from digging, and others just keep digging frantically. And I was privy to another experience recently, an officer shared. He was bringing his company to a position that was a relief for other troops that were keeping it before. And when he came there, he was asking, where are the positions? And the only positions he could see is about 2 stretches, 5 yards each, and a few half-dug foxholes around them. And on the maps, on the brigade maps, they were portrayed as the company position. To say the least, the company position should look different. It's almost like showing 2 wheels and saying, this is your tank. That's exactly the difference between what it is and what it should be. And that's the problem. So sergeants and officers often failing to make sure to force their soldiers to dig those trenches. And another problem of that is that we don't have cadre officers. When we somehow get a cadre officer in the lower rank, the whole brigade comes over to take a look. We are lacking cadre officers on the lower level, and non-cadre ones, they have other issues, mostly related to training and knowing how to. So that's what's within army. The army is failing to do certain things. Doesn't know how to, poorly organized, too many responsible. And that's one of the problems in our state, that we don't have a single-threaded organ or organization that will be in charge of building fortifications. We have too many bodies responsible for that. We, in my view, need a single-threaded organization that would be doing it all from the lowest level on the company to the highest level in strategic fortifications of the army. So we either need to change the situation where there is such body is established and is responsible, including personal responsibility for this construction, or we need to make the whole chain more effective, to diminish the number of connectors, to outline the exact areas of responsibility, and do basic value stream flow mapping. So our organization lacks in its effectivity, and it's also a very corrupt element of our army organization, and this is a lot of money rotating around the fortifications, and unfortunately that has not been solved yet. But I should remind that strategic fortifications, they provide a significant bonus to defending party, and roughly speaking, of course, this is not analytical category, it's difficult to calculate that, but roughly they diminish your losses in half and they increase the enemy's losses in 50%. And basically it makes it twice better for us and twice worse for the enemy. So now add that to the idea that still prevails in our army to fight along the front line and for whatever reason take groves in ravines that no sane professional military would be taking, and instead would probably find a better natural position to occupy that you can defend better. And natural division lines like rivers and forests and mountains and other things that is easier to defend. So it's much easier to defend us along these lines. Now imagine that we build fortification lines along the natural barriers. It would have been a much better story. It would be more comfortable to defend them. Our soldiers would be ill less. We would be having less refusers on the front, and the enemy would probably be wasting a lot more people and losing their capability to advance, just like it was at the first phase with Avdiivka. So we're going back to strategic decisions that needed to be made during this war. We discussed that before. Putin made 5 of them that I outlined, and one of them was construction of strategic fortifications. And pay attention, they are conducting an aggressive war against Ukraine, they are conducting offensive campaigns, and yet they're still building fortifications, right? We are conducting a defensive war, and yet we're very poorly organized in regards to fortification construction. This is a big drawback. If at some point after the war, when I hope Ukraine survives, historians will be looking into the details of our losses and our inefficiencies, they will definitely outline low organizational culture in the country at large, misunderstanding of the nature and the scale of problems, and corruption. These are the main reasons, as I see, for us not having proper fortification lines. This is what we pay with the lives of our soldiers for. Of course, these fortifications would not have stopped this war, but they would definitely make the situation for the offenders much worse. And their organizational methods evolution would be slowed down significantly if they had to storm our fortified positions. And that's it. It's the Central Command that is responsible and is guilty for this. They're failing to do this reform. So you said an important thing here. You said we cannot do that due to these reasons, right? I'm just trying to understand, Alexey, we're not in the 20th century. We're in the 21st century already. We have modern communication means. You can personally control everything if you want to do so. If President had a goal of creating these fortifications, he could have controlled their development. You're saying that they are marked on the map as they exist, but in reality they don't. You could have controlled it, right? Well, yeah, this is a brigade level, Nikolay. This should not be presidential control, but even if you're going to talk about the brigade level, they have a ton of problems too. And one of their problems is refusers, 30 to 70% in different detachments. Second, people often do not understand what they're fighting for, and they don't like the conditions they're fighting in, so they refuse. That's the same problem that we face when we draft them by force, and then they already have a rifle on the front, but they don't want to fight still. And we still don't have human-centric attitude in the army. There are some happy exceptions and good commanders, but at large the soldier is a thing still at this war that can be used for utilitarian purposes. And our commanders were also robbed of the full level of command and power over their reports. A simple example is when those who are panicking or refusing to fight, 2 panickers in a trench can render the fighting level of a company to near zero in about 24 hours. That's what we had in Soledar and Bakhmut. I would remind our viewers that in Britain Army, in American Army, in Israeli Army, a commander can use his arms on the panicking soldiers for refusing to fulfill the order, for cowardice. This was written in Ukrainian documents and Ukrainian regulations for the army as the inheritance from Soviet Union. But it was taken out of it later by our Congress. This is, I'm bringing very severe example here, and of course members of soldiers' families will now scream at me, say, well, how can we give these idiotic commanders the right to shoot their own people? But on the other hand, it doesn't mean the commander is going to execute everybody in his detachment. No, only in exclusive circumstances. And by the way, it was written as he should, he must, not that he can. And in 2015, our Congress removed that right from the lower level commanding officers, and we also fully or nearly completely destroyed the military justice system. Military police only has now the functions of patrolling and some investigating capability. Other services just don't fit and don't have enough capacity. And I would remind once again, what is a modern-day refuser? He basically tells his commander to go take a hike, and commander cannot punish him in any way. He first needs to get him to a medical office so he can get a medical conclusion about this person, about this soldier. On the front, it can be 20 miles away from the front line. So commander needs to find a vehicle and escort that person to that medical office. You need a driver, you need 2 escorts at least, right? You go then to that clinic or whatever is available, who often works at the schedule of the civilian time from 9 to 3 or 8 to 3. And then when you have hundreds of refusers, like in Chasov Yar, where we had literally a line of several hundred of refusers, they were laughing and spitting in the face of their commanders. There was a local deterioration of army, essentially. But without that medical commission, a commander cannot detain the soldier, cannot punish, cannot penalize in any way. So you can only detain, basically, for the purpose of medical commission. And that paralysis of the system is still ensuing. This is one of the factors. Another factor is that Ukrainian forces since 2014 have a large group of volunteer corps. And those people are indeed brave, they're talented. They take upon the craziest operations and they're eager to fight. But they also have an element of Makhno, if you remember that historic military leader of Ukraine. The more of Makhno style fighting in our army, the less order is in the army. Large-scale war needs concentration of effort, but Makhno approach doesn't allow you to concentrate things much. On one hand, it allows you to improvise more. Unlike Soviet army and Russian army, our low-level commanders have a lot of room for improvisation, especially in the volunteer corps. But in a situation where you fight a long, protracted, large-scale warfare, Makhno approach does not allow you to have strong commanders on a lower level. There's a lot of volunteering happening. And then what you end up with is that some of the lower-level commanders repeating the story of 1917, when the Tsar army officers were switching side and siding with soldiers and the rebelling troops. So they're trying to become friends with soldiers. As an officer, you should do everything to support your soldier, to train your soldier, to make sure he can survive the task and he can be effective. But you can never be friends with a soldier. If you're starting to propitiate or befriend your reports, you cannot enforce the discipline. And given that we are also a rather Facebook and social media influential country, and the fact that careers of a lot of officers on the lower levels are being promoted with the effort of some journalists that make heroes out of them. The so-called patriotic society is very concerned about these people. These people who are in the limelight of social media, they're afraid to be disciplinarians because they have on the back of their mind what will be written about them on Facebook, in the social media, by the journalists. So it's a mix of corruption and also that weird influence of public opinion on the commanding officers. And of course, we have a lot of officers who, as a result of systemic effort to destroy our military over the last 30 years, they've started building career by trying to be liked by society and become notable figures in the social and journalist media. So, again, not exactly experts in what they do, but more like a social media figures. And of course, also big money coming now from supporters who try to donate to different troops to support them. And that is also a factor that sometimes induces corruption. So between all that, the officer's corps of Ukraine is in a rather poor condition. When an officer has to think about his social media, he cannot be effective. He cannot enforce discipline. He cannot make his soldiers dig the trench. He cannot pull out the gun now by law and threaten those who refuse to obey his orders. So there is no way. That's the core of inefficiency. And the choice, as I outlined more in our previous streams for the officers, is between two poles: to serve the country or to serve the leader. Right? Very often of them do serve the leadership. And now Zaluzhny was removed. Now it's Syrsky. So many of them are now busy finding ways to become the part of the new clan of Syrsky, right? And many of them are now singing SNS to a new general, to a new command, in order to get some promotion. So add that to roughly the same system that exists in politics, where politicians also look back over the shoulder at the level of their likes, where there is an element of corruption, low-level organization, and we get the overall picture of why we are fighting so ineffectively, from the platoon commander to the company to the brigade to all the way up to the highest level of our country management. And one needs to take significant political and other responsibility in order to change that. So now in the news, we can see that Syrsky actually went to the front and started punishing commanders and started to remove them from their positions for disobeying the orders. So this is a good story generally. If it will not become a one-time action, but will become a systemic approach, we can only welcome that. But I would remind that Syrsky himself is also a product of public relations, not as a person himself. He is a different, he's actually a character, a strong character, but he was created and propped up with the social media because we now put all the hopes on that figure, because our Facebook, Makhno-style, poorly organized army is the copy of our country, which is also Makhno-like and poorly organized. And the army cannot be a separate entity from the country. If the whole society is sick with the disease, the army is going to be sick with that too, even the most elite detachments. So the problem, as I see it, is that Russians are going in a different paradigm. They are tightening the discipline. It has its own drawbacks, and they're very ineffective, and we can talk about that in a separate conversation. But our path is, unfortunately, lack of discipline. And we should be restoring the system of military justice, restoring the rights of lower-level commanders. Like, what is a division, how it is different from brigade? In Soviet divisions, they actually had detachment schools, because same problem was there. Many soldiers got promoted too early without proper training, so they had sergeant schools, officer schools, there were specialty schools, snipers, tankers, artillery, where the experience was transferred, where people were trained. That was done on a detachment level. If you now shake down the whole army of Ukraine and ask the battalion commanders, how much do you train? How much time do you dedicate to training? You probably will find maybe 15 commanders who still do some of it. The rest do not. So there are some attempts to catch and do things. In short operations, they matter, but there is no systemic approach. And this war is lasting already for 2 years. It's going to a third year. We don't know how long will it go. And of course, among the battalion commanders who grew up from soldiers, some of them continue self-training, self-education. But it is still somewhat limited. You need more systemic approach to provide better knowledge. And until we have education system, until we revive our judicial system, military justice system, until we find ways to revive detachment schools, until we start finding ways how to get rid of the real deficiencies, the main problems that we're facing will not disappear. We have big advantage in our military school. We are very fight-worthy. We're angry fighters, and Russians acknowledge that. That basically until we win, we do not relieve. We do not surrender. We continue pushing. And we are very strong in improvisation. But if you can notice that there are a lot of commentary coming out now and a lot of discussions about technical solutions, about super drones, about naval drones, about some other technologies. But any professional military officer knows that the moment you start hearing too much technical, too much praise of technical aspects, it means that there is significant deficiency on the org structure side. Once again, to those who are coming from civilian side, not all of them are aware of that, but professional military guys do know that. Anytime you start hearing excessively prompt up notes and publications about new technology, when it's too much of that, it usually indicates, and I would capitalize here, indicates, almost always, a serious drawback with organizational approach, with organization structure. That's exactly the same quote from a Soviet movie, as a German general was saying at the Second World War, saying that I'm fighting with Americans for the first year, and I'll tell you they'll be done with their technology. Technology will be the end of them. And here's the problem. We are following that same route now. For over 2 months, I'm seeing in publications an ongoing wailing about missing technical capabilities. Guys, technical capabilities are good, but they're good when they fall into the proper organizational structure. And that's how the whole humanity works, not only military. And better organization allows for better use of technical capabilities. With just technology and lack of organization, you won't go too far. So our Facebook overly used army that is emphasizing and trying to emphasize technological aspects right now, that is good to a degree, but it only outlines that we are still suffering from the low organizational culture, or lack thereof. Okay, another question, Alexey. Carte blanche from Zelensky to Commander-in-Chief Syrsky. He said that for all cadre replacements in any level of command, headquarters, General Syrsky has carte blanche to do whatever he needs. So I have a question. Did Zaluzhny have such a proposition from Zelensky as well? No, Zaluzhny had none. As a person who was working in the office of Zelensky at that time, I would say that Zaluzhny not only did not have carte blanche proposition, a lot of his proposals were blocked, purposely blocked. And okay, when they say that cadre is an important thing, yes, it is an important thing. But cadre is only element of a bigger thing called organizational approach. And it would be better if Syrsky had a carte blanche to change the structures, not just to replace people. What Central Command does not understand is that we need to change the military organization of our country. And you cannot substitute that with any drones with super AI, with cadre replacements, despite both of them being important. You cannot substitute organizational decisions that need to happen with anything else. And we need to bring more data to the Central Command. We need to be able, Central Command, to have enough professionals there. We need those people who can provide a proper connection between politicians and the warfighters and the generals. And I'll remind here once again that that connector is one of the most complex parts of military strategy. And a lot of countries, most countries, have failed to provide proper connectivity between political goals and military objectives. Sometimes some countries were successful in terms of having the same leader, political leader and military leader in one person. Alexander Macedonsky, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and some other historic figures. Soviet Union had tried a lot of organizational forms. United States have tried a lot of organizational forms. Sun Tzu was highlighting that back in his works. So, speaking of carte blanche, our system is more rigid, unfortunately. The Russian dictator Putin, who attacked Ukraine, gave more freedom to his officers than we are giving to ours. And this is a problem. It is a different side of that aspect. The fact that he gave them more freedom is an exact result of him demanding more from them, because there they have 5 generals, commanders of army level, who are being investigated, who are currently in prison. And nothing like that is happening in Ukraine. There were some investigations about the beginning of war, but not about the ongoing process. And here we take them all as heroes. We do not make them responsible. But problem is that behind calling them heroes and superstars, we do not give them tools to actually change things. And our army turns into semi-Makhno style army that improvises awesome on a high level, but very seriously is lacking on systemic approach. That's why I'm saying our army, our defense forces are yet going to become a real systemic army. We still have a lot of room to grow. That's why I'm once again repeating, we need to change the organizational system of our country. And the first thing we need to do, one of the first things, we need to create engineering corps of engineers, Army Corps of Engineers in the Ukraine army. Not just some small committee, but the actual corps that will be responsible for all the engineering developments. Okay, this is a very important segment, and thank you, Alexey, for diving into that. There were a lot of signals, and I was thinking how to bring the topic up. Indeed, Nikolay, it was a specific topic, and it needed to aggregate a certain number of publications and data. And I'm glad we're finally getting to that now, and I'm able to give my diagnosis of our engineering capability at this moment. A bunch of other publications, Alexey, this week, they also touch upon negotiations about Istanbul negotiations in 2022, in April, or when was it happening? March, April? But there is a publication in Wall Street Journal where they say that they learned about what Putin was offering back in 22, according to the project that they received that was leaked to them. And supposedly it was created by both organizations, by Ukrainian negotiators and Russian negotiators. And I would say whatever we see that there in publication is different from what I know and what was written about that before. I think you are aware of Wall Street Journal published, so I would like to hear your point of view on this. What they wrote there, the demands of Russia, are these the demands that are indeed discussed, that were discussed in April in Istanbul, or not? Nikolay, I need to open you a very scary mystery. Wall Street Journal got an intermediate version of this agreement. And of course, all the social media went around running, squawking that, oh, of course, these ones should not have been signed. These are dangerous. I want to dispel some of that and say that final agreement was different. In the final version of it, they refused from their status, suggested status of Donbass, and in the final they also were talking about withdrawing their troops from Donbass. And here they refused to discuss the status of Crimea in the one that was published by American publication, but in the real one, in the final version, they agreed to discuss that in 15 years with possible demilitarization and start of a political process of a return. So I don't know who put that intermediate project of the agreement. I think it was roughly about mid-March draft of that agreement. After that, there were 2 more attempts to storm Kiev. Every time their butts were kicked, they became a little more obedient and they were removing some of the demands. And by Istanbul, the version was much cleaner. So I have 2 versions. One of them is that Russians fed this to New Yorkers, to New York Post, or New York Times, sorry. And they're either trying to push their agenda, either way, either to try to settle peacefully or escalate to a threat of possible nuclear annihilation. But regardless of how we bring back to negotiations table, we'll be bringing back the Istanbul agreements. And this agreement had already taken a lot of work and a lot of contradictions and a lot of issues on both sides were reflected and worked through in that document. They're showing a more difficult version, basically is setting it as the new start position, because the final position in Istanbul was much softer. Or the second option, one of ours gave this data to New York Times and wanted to just score some points. And the third version would be if both things coincided, when Russians provided this data and Ukrainian public at large commented on that, and of course discussing now we cannot and we should not be ever accepting that, of course. And I can only feel sorry about Mikhail Podolyak, who now has to speak a lot about that. He did a lot of work back in the day to work on the agreements, but now he has to basically devalue his work back in March, April of 22 and try to pretend that this data was not important, that negotiation was not important. But Wall Street Journal, it was Wall Street Journal, comment from the translator who published that, they got intermediate version of it. It was not a final version of it. All right, so I have a question, Alexey. You participated in Istanbul. You were you're writing agreements about the final state of this document. Do I understand it correct that Russians asked to exclude you from the work group at the end of it? Yeah, sometime in the process, I guess I was trolling them rather correctly, that they felt too much pressure and they asked to remove me from the table. They found an official excuse. Belarus started criminal prosecution against me because I was suggesting that it would make sense to destroy railroads that Russian troops used to invade Ukraine from the north. And Belarus declared me as a terrorist, so I cannot be, according to their view, in the group discussing these agreements. So all I did there really just stepped out of the framework of the webcam, and I was sitting on the chair nearby. And I was not only participating, I was actually leading the military subgroup of that agreement. And I want to say that I know these details very well. And I still think that these agreements were ideal. I think that neither president, nor the office of the president, nor any representatives thereof have to be apologizing and excusing themselves for participating in those negotiations. They did a huge and very serious work for Ukraine in the day. And one day this document will become known and will be confirmed. And I think all the independent commentators will be able to confirm how much serious work was done back in the day. By the way, I am not a big fan of making excess compliments to the whole negotiation group, to Yermak and President Zelensky, because the work was colossal. There were very important principles set there as a part of that agreement, for which I will continue praising them. That was their initiative of our diplomacy, part of our diplomatic subgroup. That formula of peace that they created with the guarantee systems to be able to react in 24 hours to a conflict. This would be a new word of international politics, of new system of international safety. So this was suggested at the end of March of 22. Early on, that's when this idea was ready. Sooner or later, I know we'll get back to this idea again, perhaps voluntarily or perhaps after protracted, devastating war. But this was the acknowledgement of the destroyed Yalta-Potsdam negotiations, and I would say they should shoot it down. They should not be attacking themselves for these negotiations and these agreements. They should be coming out and saying that agreements were great, we should have signed them, but there were external circumstances. Some things happened, like Bucha, and we made a different decision in light of those circumstances. Because when they start apologizing for these agreements and this negotiated documents, they essentially devalue all the work that they've done. While in reality, we made a very high-level achievement there on the world of global diplomatic arena by suggesting new security system. So Putin now likes to tell that Russians withdrew their troops from Kiev, Chernihiv, and Sumy as an act of goodwill. Yeah, I partook in that act of goodwill a little bit. We've been kicking their ass all the way down to the border and even beyond. That was an act of goodwill. And they left Kiev because they were semi-encircled already there. They left to not be entrapped here and be encircled. So we kicked them out. And that, together with the Western promises of aid, allowed us as it seems to me now, with the sum of information that I have, that we made a decision to finish this war by destroying our enemy militarily on the battlefront, especially after the trauma of Bucha. It was a huge-scale event. If you remember, seeing President, what was he look like before he went there and after he left, and the other presidents and dignitaries who were visiting. So not surprising that after this event, there was a decision made to finish Putin's troops militarily. Given that we had some successes in the north, we pushed them out, and we understood that we actually can kick them and can destroy them on the front. And given the promised Western aid, that was a good perspective. Why didn't it come through? First of all, because Western aid did not fulfill the brackets that they promised to. So this is a joint responsibility, right? It's both on us and on them. But we have to acknowledge that because the whole country believed that the West will be supporting us. Johnson said that they'll be supporting us 1,000%. And above that, our Western promises that we received, our political engagement, our corruption engagement, and some other levels of vision that we could see and probably did not see at this point, that precluded us from making important 5 decisions that Putin took in his country to put it on military rails to make sure they can emphasize military production capabilities. And they're now winning slowly trying to prevail in the long way, not in regards to Kiev, Sumy, and Chernihiv as they started this war, but in regards to a bigger conflict frame as global South against global West. And in my opinion, global West has already lost this war. They can only try to replay that in order to win it. But we should not be shy. We should be acknowledging these mistakes and these effects. And this is another thing, that we are somewhat quietly shying away from the quality of Istanbul agreements on the backdrop of what Putin is saying we should have signed it, and I acknowledge that. So, first of all, we devalue the Istanbul agreement by itself, and then we devalue the next 2 years of war. Our government apparently is looking like they're afraid to acknowledge that they dropped the country into 2 years of protracted warfare, and they are concerned what will be the blowback for that. It's a weak position. You should not be apologizing for that. You have done a lot of work to build up good agreements, but due to other circumstances, a different decision was made, and now we're fighting as honestly as we can. The fact that our Western partners turned out to be rotten, well, that's what it is. And we're trying to deliver in the best way possible, to fight this war in the best way possible on our side. But I don't see the reason to negate all that work when we were sleeping maybe 15 minutes a day and working almost 24/7 to do that. I'm not even talking about the behind the screens negotiations and conversations. I think if anybody ever shoots a TV series about that, that'll be stronger than House of Cards, because the intrigue and the level of stress and how much was at stake was much higher. We should not be apologizing and walking away from that. That was a serious achievement, that U-24 strategy that we had there. Regardless of how this war will be over, this achievement will likely hit the school books. So I don't understand why they're walking away from it. Basically, whoever made a decision to either keep it quiet under the wraps or to deny that is making a big mistake. I'm making a note here and suggestion: stop apologizing for that. All right, let's turn it, Alexey, in a different angle. The angle that they're afraid to take responsibility for having shoved the country into 2 more years of war. And in essence, it is connected to how the West performed and behaved. Now we do have numbers. Over the course of 2023, Western aid dwindled by 40%. And all the marks and estimations about the possible defense resource of the West, they are rather catastrophic, right? We have not seen them before this war. I have recently watched the interview by Eric Prince. He is the founder of Blackwater, American private military company. He's the one who is making sure that military tasks set in front of him and his company are being fulfilled. And he is engaged in a lot of operations with American Army and special services. And he is saying that defense resource of the West is rather puny. it's weak. So, of course, there are reasons I understand that played their own role, but I can suspect that the logic is that people are still expecting aid from West right now in Ukraine. So we cannot effectively blame the West too much because we do need their help still, if we acknowledge that properly. No, I don't think so. I don't think so, Nikolay. The right communication is always telling the truth. You can just find a better way to communicate it. And we can pay attention to another aspect. The West did not know their own potential at this point. Of course, one can say that you should have used your heads and think and do the calculation and evaluate your politics that you've conducted over 32 years. But it's like coming to, I don't know, suburban teacher somewhere in a middle school and asking him why he's not Newton or why he's not a Nobel Prize laureate, right? We can just acknowledge that we did not listen to certain figures, certain people who were giving good advice even back then, but, we didn't. It's just like some other commentator recently said, well, who could have supposed that Russia would violate Minsk I agreements? And I did answer him that you were in the position, signing these agreements, to be able to foretell if Russia would break or not out of these agreements. And if you fail to, that's your responsibility, right? But responsibility doesn't always equate with guilt. The West, for example, honestly tried to relaunch their military production since 23, but failed to because they have too many things to tweak, to change. Because since 1991, they were not ready for that. They were dismantling their military defense system to a large degree, and they're more focused on different articles than what we need. They could not evaluate the proper strategy against Putin. They did not expect global South versus global West. These are their strategic mistakes and miscalculations for which the West will carry its own brunt of responsibility, both historical and personal. But back in the day, they did not know that. They seriously planned that they can help Ukraine. Even now, many of them still do. And at least they start to ask the right questions now. The level of politics and politicians in the world went down significantly. And I'm afraid serious conclusions are not being drawn from these events. It means that mechanisms of lessons learned have been dismantled in the West, both here and in the West. And it tells a lot about both of us. But if you look at this locally, not from afar, from big perspective, but in April of 22, when we refused to continue with Istanbul negotiations, we did not cancel them, we just put them on ice, essentially. Then nobody knew these factors. None of those making decisions were aware of the military capabilities of the West. So we made serious strategic mistakes, our analytics was wrong, and we made decisions in the framework that we suspected was correct at this moment, we considered to be correct at this moment. Boris Johnson this week gave another interview to Dmitry Gordon, suddenly, where, among other things, he declared that Russia is not technologically rich, the West is 20 times more advanced as Russia, and the West will not allow the destruction of Ukraine. So, in regards to that industrial capability of the West, that it's 20 times better than Russia, do you think this is a very cynical manipulation on the backdrop of him not including the capabilities of Iran, North Korea, and China one way or another into Russian production capabilities? Well, we don't know if that is manipulation or not because we don't know his intentions. We can ask him a few questions, though. How many tanks does the British Army have? What are the numbers of British infantry? How can one explain two recent failures of attempts to launch missiles from British submarines? Why both of them failed? How high technology West correlates with inability of British fleet to get recruits for the two new frigates that they produced? They have two vessels, they have no crew. How does the production of shells for the Challenger tanks or shots for NLAWs or their vessels that cannot get out of the repairs? Is that all high technologically country? How many tanks does the United States produce a year? Does anyone know? Zero. Not a single tank. And that's why the whole army of the United States is only modernizing the existing Abrams. And they're only doing that at about 20 pieces a year. That's roughly what burns near Avdiivka over one day, sometimes in one attack. And Russia produces 200, even if we say, okay, 100. And then they take 800 out of storage and repair and refit to use them on the front. The West just fails to understand or doesn't want to understand. Many people whom I see, they just still not understanding that in the war of that scale, 1,000 of T-55s that they're laughing at are much better than 200 Abrams. Because Abrams needs to be produced in a fashion that they would not be breaking apart on the second day of work, because when the filters get clogged, they fail, right? These tanks are for highways warfare, not for the steppes. They're not designed for heavy fighting like we carried here. Of course, 200 Abrams can destroy 500 Russian tanks near Zaporozhye, but meanwhile they can throw another 500 tanks in a different part of the front, and what? So if we're going up to the strategic level, the West still fails to understand that the epoch of big wars are back upon us, where everything is different. The principles of organization of military-industrial complex, the principles of political interaction with army and with society, they're all different. So here you need generally a so-called Soviet or Chinese model, where you have a ton of cheap equipment, rather effective, and conveyor production just drowns your enemy in these thousands of units. And the bet of the Western armies after 91 is very small army, very professional, super expertly trained, and very expensive and specific equipment. So Hussites throw a challenge to the West, and the coalition starts to hit Hussites' camels and Hussites' houses. Okay, good. So you've killed 2 camels and 4 warehouses, and you've spent $450 million on that airstrike. What next? You've caused the damage maybe in Hussites' prices for $2 million, right? How long can this war last? And how? So that's why I'm saying, and the head of private military company, Eric Prince, right, he's outlining exact same problem. And there are more and more voices showing up now that the West needs to reconsider their principles of military organization. Because if you model the hypothetical clash of the West with Russia, with China, with Iran, they, of course, can strike and do initial strike and destroy all the military production in a day, right? And all the energy systems. Russia is in the darkness, and then millions of Russian men, upset with that attack, get the rifles circa 1920s and then cross the Baltic or Polish borders. What do you do next? Yeah, ill-equipped, poorly dressed. They probably have a uniform of 1941, but they're at your border and they're shooting at you. Are you going to shoot at each of them with a tomahawk? Get F-35s in the air? You'll have to fight them at a distance of 10 yards. You'll have to shoot them in the face. And who in the West still has enough art of trench fighting, trench warfare? And not only knows how to do that, but where does the West find hundreds of thousands of people who can do that? Because when they discover that they're out of tomahawks and their military complex cannot produce enough for such a scale of war, because investment in the shells is tens of billions of dollars, going since the summer of 2022, only led to the price increase from 1,500,000 to about 8,000 per artillery shell. And they increased the production maybe by 10%. That's why super investments in some of these products, they only cause super price increases and not the production capability increase. And Russia is actually trying to do the right thing there. They're nationalizing their military production, and not even all of them. They actually leaving some of them to be private. But the way it works, it can work in a big warfare, is that the government places an order with the private company, and the private company produces for the government. Russia did not invent anything new there. They're using the same old model that United States invented during the Second World War. The company manufacturing is private. Government loans the money to produce the articles. The company uses the money to pay salaries and for some marginal profit, but they're forbidden to remove this money outside of the country, to siphon them anywhere outside. So, if anything, the workers actually get better pay, right? And at the end, the government gets their shells and the company is happy with getting the money. If Russia would allow their companies to export the money outside the country, that would have been a catastrophe. I can remind us how we were building our roads. That was our local catastrophe here in Ukraine. We were building roads. That's a good thing, right? That was important. We actually can move our troops, maneuver effectively using these roads. But unfortunately, we were buying some components for the road, some materials in Belarus. Tar was purchased in Belarus. And we shouldn't be purchasing everything. We should have bought most with our own companies. And then it was Turkish companies who were building the roads, and we allowed them to export the money. And these decisions led us to having a big hole where we should have had a good achievement. So they're learning in Russia. They copied American model, and it was one of those important strategic decisions I talked about. And then if they do suffer a loss in this war, and Russia is destroyed, for example, all the jets, all the missiles go and shoot down everything that Russia has militarily. Then we're forgetting that China and Iran may also start adding their resources to Russia to fight back. So their infantry with 1920s rifles will become eventually motorized infantry, then mechanized infantry, and it's a long-term proposition. And the Global South is actually very interested in defeating the West at large and moving the center of human civilization to within its own borders. This is actually their official program that was announced quite a few years ago. So Russia is making 2.7 million artillery shells next year, 2.5 this year. They're supposedly getting about 2 millions from North Korea, half of them perhaps not fly. In general, it'll be 3.5 millions. The whole West was promising 1 million. We somehow managed to get 300,000. Fantastic, right? Now we have some good news that in Avdiivka direction, Ukrainian artillery is working very actively for the second day. Awesome. Perhaps we got some shells. Maybe it's enough to maintain it some parity to autumn. But what next? Will the West be able to produce more shells by that time? I'm in Washington right now. I have a bunch of meetings now. And there are two very important words being said very often here. First is capability to react. And the second is strategic ambiguity. How they say that? Yeah, strategical ambiguity, right. So, what does it mean? Their message is neither treacherous Biden nor terrible Trump is precluding America from sending military resources to Ukraine. The main culprit are American military, because when they're told, let's give some resources to Ukraine, they're saying we cannot dwindle the resource that we have. We need to maintain a certain responsibility and certain resource here, because we have calculations for bigger engagements with China, with Russia. So we have to keep a certain number of HIMARS and the other pieces of equipment in the desert. These are our stockpiles that we cannot donate. And politicians are shrugging shoulders and saying, well, we asked the military, but they're not doing it, right? President can actually sign an order and force its military to transfer a bunch of resources to Ukraine. But his military are responding to him that, no, we can't, because our responsibility for certain stockpiling needs to be maintained. So they need to make a decision that their responsibility actually should be covering that war in Europe, because that's essentially nearly the war with Russia. But they're stubborn and they're holding their own position right now. And somebody still needs to come to American military generals and say, your calculations do depend on Ukraine winning this war. And we must give these resources to Ukraine as a framework of a global conflict with Russia. And then military, if president gives this order correctly, military would say yes, sir, and would deliver that, right? Because in a bigger picture, that would mean weakening their opponent as a framework of big scenario. But nobody is going for that. It's election year for president. If he makes such a decision, any of his opponents will come out and say he is weakening America against the global threats, and he'll be done for. He'll be done with. And your only hope will come with the new president of the United States, whoever it will be. So you need to hang on for 2024. And I'm saying, well, thank you guys. That's fantastic news. And I asked them another question. Do you remember whom the United States saved since the 50s of last century, strategically? And they scratched their heads and said, well, of course, Kosovo, Kuwait, and South Korea. And I understood, Nikolay. Our plan of salvation must be that our country needs to be named with the letter K, and then maybe we'll get that help. Sarcasm here. End of part 1.